There's so many like verbs that occur to me when I think about projective identification. Parasite is not a verb, but like a parasite like burrows inside you. Like there's like incursions. There's, we're going to get to like the idea of projection, introjection, like all, but like, man, this was not true about verbs. I guess I was talking about nouns. Whatever. This whole episode is going to be about slippage between categories, so that's fine. We'll go with it. But it's something about like invasion. You know, I mean, we can think about like being a container, being a receptacle, but that means you have to contain something. There's a certain kind of like intolerableness to the experience, I think, sometimes of projective identification. I was going through a book that I think is really for clinicians, but that, you know, the Nancy McWilliams' psychoanalytic diagnosis, which, you know, is one of those books where it's just like, why have I not like just been reading this every day for
it's almost
all
too
of my
good.
life? It's so
she's
good.
Scary.
And there's this line about like how this is like projective identification is like known for giving a particular kind of headache to clinicians. And it's like, I was thinking about this as a non-clinician, just as a person, you know, who works with other people in settings that often include like extreme emotion. And I was just like, if only it were just a headache and not that feeling of being taken over. I mean, you think of like the occupied, but you think of like The Exorcist even. And also just the sense of like, it's so contrary. So like modern, like this is all air quotes, modern Western conceptions of the boundaries between people is the idea is that no one can actually make you feel a thing. I was even thinking about that old line, like, what is it? The Eleanor Roosevelt line, like, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And I was like, have you ever met a person?
Yeah.
Right.
Like they can make you feel inferior and like so many much more upsetting things.
Well, and the idea of consent sort of flies in the face of the idea of the unconscious.
Yes.
I think the possession analogy is striking. I was looking at some secondary historical literature, like tracing the prehistories of projective identification, and part of it got into it's like 19th century spiritualism, parapsychology stuff, and this idea of like transferring a thought into the other person and sort of mesmerist kind of operations or seances. And it, in a way that is both like spooky in experience, but also I think sometimes activates like a skepticism or even a desire to like not seem like you're trying to excuse yourself for something, right? Like you made me feel this isn't on me, really. It is a domain, concept, and a set of experiences I think that are can be really disquieting. And just to be very candid and own my difficulty conceptually with this concept, I think I'm here for us to unpack it, but also like my experiential thing with this is that I can't be in a room with people who emote in certain types of ways, right? And it's not, I don't think you could pay me enough. Like I literally pick up on certain types of anxiety and aggression in ways where I just feel like I am not just like responsible for it, and that I think is a more higher level sort of thing, but more just like my skin starts to crawl or I feel like I'm going to jump out of myself. And the mental image I have here to why the possession thing is coming to mind is like in all those horror movies when someone shows up, like the kid shows up after having been in the basement, or the long lost relative appears on the porch, and everyone in the family seems to think it's all okay, except there's like one dog that's like barking at them or pissing itself. Like that's like how I feel in the face of like subtle bids, right? Or like knowing that this could be someone who is not just like experiencing in that space or state, but is trying also to communicate consciously and otherwise. It really maybe it's because like my sense of like stability of self is harder won, or I'm not as integrated. I'm not sure, but maybe that's all. It reflects something in me that is,
yeah. I mean, it's paranoiagenic, I think. It induces a kind of a schizoid splitting in oneself, where the fear of being taken over sort of overrides any sense of groundedness. And I mean, I think that's the challenge and the artistry of clinical work, of surrendering to that on the one hand and remaining cohesive and clear about oneself on the other, with varying degrees of success.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to welcome back to the show Brian Ngo-Smith. Brian is a psychoanalyst and clinical social worker in private practice in Denver, Colorado, where he is also on faculty at the Denver Institute for Psychoanalysis. He has worked in the mental health field for over 20 years in residential, psychiatric hospital, and community mental health settings. Brian is a past president of the American Association for Psychoanalysis and Clinical Social Work, and he was the recipient of the 2024 Ernst and Gertrude Tico Memorial Award from the American Psychoanalytic Association. Listeners will also remember Brian from one of, actually, it's been like an all-time favorite episode for so many of our listeners, the episode we did with you almost 2 years ago now, Brian.
2 years ago.
Yeah. Talking about your remarkable essay, This Couch Has Bed Bugs, on the psychoanalysis of homelessness and the homelessness of psychoanalysis. We still get messages about that episode. We are so delighted and couldn't think of a better interlocutor to be here for not one, but a little mini series on projective identification. Brian, welcome back. We're so happy that you're here.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think I might be the right subject because I rely on projective phenomena in my personal life so much. And we'll probably be using lots of examples from my marriage.
Honestly, thank God. Because I mean, obviously I'm glad that you're, I presume your marriage is thriving. I hope nothing but the best for that. But
it's true. No, I think I meant that as a sort of level the playing field, that everyone uses these, whether they want to or not. Get that straight out of the way.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you're saying that, because also too, what you're immediately saying there, and I want to flag this for the audience, is that this is on the one hand, a very really complicated concept that pushes on our understandings of self and other, of our own self-awareness and agency, about how much we like authentically, if we want to use that language, can relate to one another, like where our feelings come from, all these things. And it has all these ethical and other concerns too, and then ramifies, as we'll talk about in a subsequent episode, institutionally, but also that the term does name something that is real. And those complications capture situations that are intense and complicated, and oftentimes exemplarily in intimate relationships and not just in the clinical context. So as people are listening to this and may find themselves struggling, we'll deal with those struggles with vocabulary or thinking through sort of the theoretical models. I am just so glad that you're here with us in your capacity as a clinician and someone who just thinks in these terms more broadly to elucidate all the stakes of this.
I'm really glad to be here.
On that note, I'm going to take a stab at pitching a framework, or at least leveling a playing field for thinking about projective identification, that hopefully whoever is listening to this, no matter their background or terminological sophistication, can find some way in.
Yeah, absolutely. We should stipulate, this is a complicated concept. We're going to try to do justice to it, but it's going to demand I mean, from us, but also even more from you, the listener, a certain amount of patience as we kind of come at it from a bunch of angles, because it is one of those things that, well, and I'll say this just as somebody who, occupational hazard tends to think sort of abstractly. It's hard to get a handle on abstractly. But then once you've done that, sometimes then the examples still kind of skitter out of your reach. And if you start with the examples, then the sort of broader abstraction of it can do the same. So we need to kind of tackle it on a bunch of fronts. Yeah. And I think what you're doing, Patrick, is going to just sort of sketch out a little bit of like, what even is this as a phenomenon?
And even to follow up on what you're saying, Abby, right? And this, I think, is a handle that people who have been listening to us and like to think in these terms may find useful. Elucidating the particular stakes and contours of this term, projective identification, requires thinking analogically, right? It requires thinking a little bit about theories of like the development of the subject psychoanalytically. It requires thinking a little bit about certain types of behaviors that we might call pathological, or certain types of situations that we might describe as ones of acute mental distress. It also requires us thinking about clinical phenomena, like things that happen in that particular space of psychodynamic or psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and then eventually too to groups. And I think the bid that we want to make to everyone listening to this is to, one, think analogically and try and perceive these kind of patterns, because a lot of the story of projective identification is people elaborating or exploring certain themes in these different domains, historically speaking, right? Expanding understandings of development and working with different types of patients and thinking about different types of pathologies leads to a more robust and then differing versions of this concept. But also, too, to try and not think about projective identification or even any of the other sort of building block concepts that we'll work through to get there, namely like the idea of defense mechanisms or projection, et cetera, as narrowly being normative or stigmatizing or even pathological, right? Just to broadly think about these as ways in which the psyche is consolidated or comes apart. And ways in which like the psyche expresses itself or we express ourselves to one another. And that even as we may want to think about how, by analogy, some stuff that may be developmental may be reflected in certain pathological states, and things that are clinical may be related to things that are more quotidian and workaday in our organizational or intimate lives, that the effort here is trying to be descriptive, right? To think about stuff in terms of a spectrum and in terms of how these are things, and here I'm thinking of this defense mechanism specifically, that just manifests as part of maybe normal development at different times, but also just in everyday life. So my quick stab here then to say this, right, is that the term projective identification has two words in it, namely this idea of a projection, right, which we can understand as a defense mechanism, right? It's a way that the ego or the psyche more broadly deals with stuff that is felt to be a threat from it, inside or outside, right? And of which it's one of many. We can name other defense mechanisms, and I suspect we will, right? Like denial or somatization or any of these other ways in which something noxious or bothersome is pushed outwards, and that's a sort of a metaphor to track analogically. And then identification, which is another sort of psychic operation of finding congruence with or attuning yourself towards or framing your own being in relation to something, right? But that the paradox of this term is that projective identification, when you put those two things together, it's not quite the sum of its parts, and it means something a little bit more and less than that at the same time. So like it's not like literally a projection of identification, right? Because we might think like identification is something I project anyways, right? I identify this person as being XYZ, or I identify myself with this other, right? And these are all sort of like me putting something on somebody else. But rather, what I think we could do is think about this in terms of like almost like the broader philosophical or even like existential stakes of like the defense mechanisms or projection or identification more generally, namely like what does it take libidinally, psychically, and how does it happen over time that we get a sense of a stable sense of self, of if we get that, of like an ownership of our feelings versus a desire not to relate to certain other feelings or things. In other words, like even on the level of like, how do we determine what's inside us or outside us?
Harder than it might initially seem. Yeah.
Well, and I think this is where the concept, you know, not only has it evolved in terms of where it began, and maybe we'll back up and think about projection first and then kind of move into where Klein comes in. But even how Klein was making use of the concept is quite different in my reading, at least, from how most people are thinking about it nowadays clinically. To say nothing of where Bion fits into that. We'll get there too, I'm sure. But right, it's the sort of differentiating between inside and outside. So there's controversy even within the term. Like, can there be an identification for an infant who has yet to differentiate between self and object? And this is where the sort of the Freudians and the Kleinians split from one another, quite famously, you know. But maybe, I mean, I'm just thinking of starting with Sigmund, and I think that this is coming from the Laplanche-Pontellier dictionary that says, although Freud recognizes projection in rather diverse areas, he assigns it a fairly strict meaning. It always appears as a defense, as the attribution to another person or thing of qualities, feelings, or wishes that the subject repudiates or refuses to recognize in himself. And so then I guess the kind of the split occurs around this question of whether the operation of projection and introjection presupposes the sort of differentiation between inside and outside, or if it constitutes it. And this is, you know, the Freudians say it has to presuppose it. You can't be doing this move if there's no differentiation between inside and outside. And the Kleinians say that actually this phenomenon constitutes the differentiation between inside and outside.
I wonder if one way we can kind of just loosely square that circle for the purposes of our heuristics,
not for the purposes of solving this like argument,
is just to, and particularly for people who are thinking about this for the first time, just sort of sit with the idea that whether it's a one-off thing that has to happen in a particular sequence, or it's a thing that, you know, can take a whole different sort of developmental pathway, that boundary between self and other, between inside and outside, is not given. It emerges over time, and it takes work. There's an expenditure there. It's a structure. But even as I think Klein mentions in the essay that we read for a day, like, think about the structures like little fish on the bottom of the sea, right? Where they have to exist in a certain type of pressure. And their structure is just as much a pushing outward against the crippling weight of water on them as it is a sort of like it's like you might anatomize or find in a museum. So like that I guess what I want us to think is almost dialectically or dynamically, or we leave almost the question open, like at least for now, that somehow the way the self is set up, or the way that the self begins to experience itself as a whole, always already inevitably has to involve some sort of relation to the not self in this kind of bootstrapping operation that's demanding.
Like Brian said, like this terminology is shifting. The way that folks talk about projective identification now is not the same or not identical to how it appears in Klein, who originates it. And I think at the risk of like going like one step forward, two steps back, because I want to make sure we do get to walk through more carefully some of the ground that Patrick just covered in terms of like what's projection, what's identification, what's projective identification, and also what does that have to do with this other term that's not yet in the mix, which is introjection. I want to suggest the following, because I want to give people who are listening, those who are not clinicians and who have not, unlike us, spent the last, what is it that you said, Patrick, the other day? Because this is coming out a little while after Thanksgiving, but yesterday was Thanksgiving. And you were like, we're just reading about projective identification instead of enacting it with our families, right? But I think it would be, I think it would be really good, perhaps for the sake of people getting at least a tentative handle on it from some of the ways each of us have learned to talk about it or think about it, both in terms of like, are there texts that have helped you get a handle on it? Are there examples? Maybe we could kind of throw a few of those out and let them kind of accumulate and resonate, and then go backwards into all, like, being really precise about all of those terms. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's sensible to me.
In that case, I'm going to bring in a definition, which also happens to be, this is probably like the text that my people can't see me, but my desk is like completely covered with books right now for this episode. I'm going to bring in the text that I consulted that was the least like properly within like a psychoanalytic canon. But it's the way that I first came to learn about projective identification in a way that made sense to me, which is Teresa Brennan's book, The Transmission of Affect, which came out in 2004. It was published posthumously in part because Teresa Brennan died tragically while writing this. But it's it's from that period when there was a major trend in certain parts of the humanities towards what we call affect theory. And most of affect theory had nothing to do with psychoanalysis, but Teresa Brennan was like, oh, you got to get into Klein. You got to get into Bion. And this book famously starts with her trying to appeal to people who might not feel any sympathy towards the idea that someone else can make you feel a feeling by appealing to the very workaday example that's something like, is there anyone among us? I'm not quoting this directly. It's but it's something like, is there anyone among us who has not walked into a room and felt the atmosphere? Right? It's like, oh, your parents were fighting, right? Or like somebody was just having sex. Like there's like all sorts of happy feelings. And if it was happy sex, I guess, but this is like a very common experience. And she goes on then to talk about how we have this profound resistance to the idea that emotions are anything other than ours, right? That they're communicable. And she goes on to give what I found to be such a good, helpful, and it's really comes from Klein, but you can tell that Bion is the person that she's really drawing on. A great definition, which I think is going to give people, especially people who already have a sense of like, oh, I know what projection means, which I think is a much more generally used term, like colloquially, than projective identification. Okay. So she says, very, very pithily, a projection is what I disown in myself and see in you. A projective identification is what I succeed in having you experience in yourself, although it comes from me in the first place. So that's very nice. And then she gives one quick example afterwards, which I'm going to, and it's sort of low stakes also, so I'm going to continue with it. She says, for example, with my projection, I may see you as unimaginative to avoid feeling that way myself, although somewhere I probably do. With my projective identification, you actually feel unimaginative, while I do not.
Oh, that's good.
Isn't that good?
Mm-hmm. My example of encountering it, apart from in the text that we all read today together, and which I still struggle with after I've read them 20 years ago, and they're still very hard. It comes from my memories of doing analytic training and having colleagues who I knew very well as people, right? I knew what their styles were. I knew what they would or wouldn't say. Like who would be, I'd go to this person for that, or I go to that person for this. And I had a sense, in other words, of what their character was, to the extent to which we can never know that, but that they would sometimes, and not just in case conferences, but like literally just, over beers or something, or at the end of a long week, or generally 2 drinks in, or even sometimes like they'd call you and they'd be upset. I'm not talking about like violating confidentiality. I'm just talking about them like being overwhelmed by an experience that's of something that had happened when they were working with a patient, and there was some sort of outburst from them, or they suddenly like, I can't believe I said this, or I keep having recurrent thoughts about hitting my patient with a clipboard. And meanwhile, there she is on the couch, and she's so petite, and she's been so abused, and what's going on with this, right? And sometimes when you get more details about this in the like clinical case sort of consult, so maybe narrating it, you'd sometimes have things that, or these stories that would kind of remind me of how, I don't know if anyone's been in relationships that have had these kind of dynamics where it's like the patient would be, oh, you're going to get angry at me. No, you're going to get angry. It's only a matter of time before you get angry. I mean, they start mumbling more and more and more. And the doctor is like, no, I'm not going to get angry with you. I'm not going to get angry at you. And the person is just like saying this stuff. And finally the patient's like, the doctor's just like, would you please speak the fuck up? I cannot hear you. And then suddenly the doctor is angry, and the patient somehow seems gratified by that.
That's right. It gratifies the omnipotent wish to be able to control the other.
Yeah. And part of what was so disruptive, it was so strange that have more senior analysts be like, no, that's part of how this is supposed to work. Like you just learned something about this person, right? Or you thought you broke the frame, maybe you didn't. But so the way I encountered it were, and please, I already made the caveats about not making this about like excusing behavior, because I think what you do and what you enact versus what you feel is this thing that therapists probably have to be better than average folks at doing. But all the same was the regularity with which people who I knew their character and I knew that they kept an even keel would suddenly find themselves describing themselves as having done something that everyone who knew them was like, that's out of character, and that would be bewildering even for them.
Well, and I think that's the challenge in the clinical situation of, as an old supervisor said, wearing the hat that the patient hands to you. That, and this is where some of these concepts, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, like the idea of transference is different than projection, but they're sort of operating in the same kind of neighborhood, of something being ascribed to you, let's say you, the analyst or the therapist, that doesn't necessarily feel like it belongs to you, although sometimes it does. And that's the other component, I think, of the identification side of projective identification, is sometimes the thing that's being projected into you is quite concordant with your own self-conception. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's quite discordant. And in the scenarios in which it's quite discordant, it can lead to a quasi-breakdown, or even like a form of illness, as opposed to really running with the identification and feeling quite, fine with it. Like when somebody projects in the idea that, being quite confident or capable or ambitious or a good leader. I mean, all of these qualities that I would be sort of pleased to have assigned to me. But then you notice that they're suddenly missing in the other person. And I think that's one of those critical clues that this might be happening.
Brian, do you have like a moment or a text that, kind of helped this click for you initially?
I mean, the first time I heard about it was from my first analytic therapist. And I think I was having some kind of an argument with a roommate, and just wasn't understanding what was going on inside of me that felt totally not mine. Often around kind of like sadomasochistic phenomena, of sort of do or done to kind of stuff. And I think that projective phenomena, projective identification, is often kind of goes part and parcel with those more do or done to victim perpetrator kinds of back and forth dynamics. So it was very helpful for me to get slightly disentangled from that. I think the example, I mean, it's funny because this is one of those concepts that I don't know when I first learned it or when it first crystallized, because I feel like I'm still learning it and it's still crystallizing. And in particular, when it happens, in my personal life, there was a moment several years ago, early in my marriage. And I don't know, my husband has this capacity to just not identify with projections, but to sort of catch hold of them and then meaningfully not react. It's really astonishing.
Yeah.
He's a much better analyst than I am, and he's not an analyst. But I was saying something quite hateful, I'm sure, about a loved one, and as I'm wont to do, and then
as we are all wont to do.
Well, right, and then I became pretty paranoid that my husband was horrified by what I was doing. And then I proceeded to accuse him of being horrified by what I was doing and judging me and condemning me in his mind. Of course, none of this I had access to. He wasn't really saying or doing anything. I was just certain that this is what was going on in his mind. And I said something about, you must think I'm just a really awful, awful person. And he calmly said, I mean, I will if you need me to.
Wow.
I was in analysis still at the time. And when I told my analyst, she almost fell out of her chair laughing. She was so delighted. I think if she could have, she would have high-fived him.
That's remarkable.
That's her blessing for your marriage too, I think. Like someone who has that capacity for, wow. I think, maybe I could pull back and just, I'm trying to think, I'm making a small list of like themes or terms that are ordinary language that we can carry with us as we go forward, right? And what's very striking about them is that they're all in binary pairs, right? And that we get a little anxious about slippage between those binary pairs. But we've got the like, this is me, this is not me. This is you, and this is me, which is slightly different. And then also sort of this distinction between like the active and the passive. Like this is being done to me, or you are doing this to me, or I am being this way. And some of those things can be synonyms. Some of those relationships or those binaries map onto one another cleanly in certain circumstances, but in other ways they don't necessarily. So it's like it's a confusion along, or at least we could begin to point to a phenomena that activates or is present in a confusion between the terms of those binaries, and also that kind of traverses multiple sets of them.
What that makes me think of is another, pretty critical concept. Thinking of the paper that Klein wrote from which projective identification arose, was notes on some schizoid mechanisms from 1946. And so she's talking about, it's schizoid basically just means split, to split between two things. Self and other, good and bad, particularly good and bad. And so she comes up with this idea of the schizoid position. Well, she first calls it the paranoid position. Fairbairn, a contemporary, is calling it the schizoid. And she ends up bridging the two and calling it the paranoid schizoid. So this is the position that many people are probably familiar with, the paranoid schizoid position versus the depressive position. You can think in terms developmentally, but that's only helpful insofar as to get your head around it. These are positions that we're all always vacillating in and out of. But one of the hallmarks of the paranoid schizoid position, is the splitting of good and bad. And it's from this position that often projective identification is operating, because there is a fundamental lack of integration that is a hallmark of the depressive position. And, maybe we'll get more into that, but projective identification isn't only occurring in the paranoid schizoid. It's more about the degree of intensity and absoluteness. The sort of the absolutism of the paranoid schizoid position is really one of its great features. Things are all this or all that, and I think people who work with folks that are kind of in a more borderline level of organization are familiar with that cognitive black or white thinking. This is really grown out of the paranoid schizoid position of needing things to be this or that.
This might be a good moment, and I'm thinking about this also because we did an episode once on splitting, it was a paywalled episode, and it was about Donald Trump. It was after Joe Biden's last debate, where and we talked about Trump splitting by talking about things like America being the greatest country that's ever existed versus shithole countries.
Right.
We were talking about just this is sort of like Manichaean approach to the world. I'm bringing this up right now, not just because I think that has like some sort of traction. I think people will hear that and be like, oh yeah, right. I've encountered people like so-and-so is the greatest, so-and-so is the worst, right? There are people that you will run into who have a habit of being like, of lumping people into one or those two. You know, there's this sort of idealization and then total devaluation, right? But one of the things that I think is important to get across here is the extent to which projective identification is often something that we associate, that we treat it negatively, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not only is it like Nancy McWilliams says, like a headache to deal with, but it is often associated with people who've been diagnosed as borderline. And that's not wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is important to say that splitting is something that everybody has to go through. And that even the most like, quote unquote, well-integrated personality as an adult will still engage in this, even though it's a very primitive defense. And what I'm really building to is that projective identification, even though it has these sorts of, I think, for a lot of people, negative connotations, is also fundamentally a form of communication. It's something that we all still do, even as adults, even as, again, like fairly well-integrated adults. It may not be the primary mode of our communication, but it is something that is a form of communication and that is operative kind of, across the board.
Some disambiguation might be helpful here to connect the dots also to kind of the stakes of what we might call like the defense mechanisms more generally.
Yeah, that would be good.
When someone, if you're having a fight with somebody and you say you're being defensive, right? That's never good. That's rarely a good thing, right?
What? I never say that.
Well, what doing this reading made me think about, Abby, was how sometimes maybe the question isn't, the question would be like, what's the opposite of being defensive, right? In some of those encounters, it might be, maybe I should be more open and listening to you, right? But other times people are defensive because they feel under assault, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or another way of saying this is that the defense mechanism, or defense mechanisms more broadly, and people can do different lists of them, right? I think I can get a book of 101 of them, and Anna Freud, I think 47, and different levels, different strokes for different folks on this stuff. But like the idea here is that they are not, just because they're called defense mechanisms, oppositional, bad, or negative normatively, but that they're rather like safeguards, or they're about defending something. And in that sense, they may also be developmentally things that you develop or have to have in order to have a self that is defended, right? And in that sense too, I want to make sure that we evacuate as much as possible similar sort of like normative assumptions vis-a-vis the language of either the schizoid, right? Which just, I think we want to say very technically, like has this etymological sense of it's being about a cut. It's about a split. It's not necessarily, etymologically, it's related to the schizoids and schizophrenia, but it doesn't quite mean that in that sense, right? And Klein herself will go to pains to be like, I'm not saying all babies are literally, paranoid or schizophrenic, right? And ditto for paranoid too, that these are positions, as you say, they're structures, right? And they can only be understood in relation to one another.
Mm-hmm.
But also more broadly, the question of how the defense mechanisms can be described as variously more sophisticated or primitive is also not necessarily a normative distinction, but rather more about like a developmental sequence or the ways in which they relate to problems that are cruder or more complicated respectively, i.e., and here I'm with Nancy McWilliams, like a lot of the primitive defense mechanisms are about establishing the they're about the self, or whatever we're going to call the self. And part of the problem here too is we're talking about like neonates and Klein specifically, right?
Yeah,
These
like
are,
incipient selves, selves, incipient
becoming
selves.
self, right? Or like the pre-self,
like the infantile ego, if you want to say that there is such a thing. Yeah,
establishing its relationship to the world, or being about like self and world. And that then the other more complicated defense mechanisms are about like, well, what specific things are within me, right? It's a little bit more metacognitive almost. But the theme I kind of wanted to really hit throughout all this is this idea that these defense mechanisms are understood, again, not to be bad per se, to be developmentally necessary at certain points, and to be key features of how, we use a sort of foreign language here because that may be a little helpful, like the subject gets made. And another sort of three related terms I kind of wanted to put down here, these are all variations of the same, right? But like is the idea of, and much like the paranoid, schizoid, and the depressive, or splitting versus denial or whatever, you have to understand them and related to one another, right? We can sort of work backwards and say that, nominally speaking, the like normal, or at least neurotic person has a more or less integrated sense of self, right? And at that point, if we have integration as sort of like a normative sort of structural center, on the one hand, you have the possibility of disintegration, right? Which is the integrated thing falling apart. But then also, and before that, temporarily, you have the state of unintegration, which is the kid or the person on the track to becoming integration before they have become an integrated thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of what is so powerful about the projective identification as a specific defense mechanism that's tethered to some of these phenomena and developments is that those intense kind of encounters, those bewildering encounters, like you were just describing, actually, or like these very clarifying, but also encounters that reveal, like you're having a fight with someone and it's like, well, if it had been spread out over several sessions and been analyzed from a position of neutrality, you'd call it transference neurosis, right? Here, it's like it's like a pressure cooked transference. Well, I want to call it like a psychosis, or it's something much more intense and destabilizing than just misidentifying attributes of a person, right? Or like living out your relationship to your boyfriend in the way it might be like you might be your dad, right? Here, it's a much more radical thing that cuts at the stakes of integration or of disintegration or of being unintegrated, respectively.
I'm wondering if it would help to try to situate like what's going on in the paranoid schizoid and what's going on in the depressive, thinking in the kind of the Kleinian register of the infant who is, sort of necessarily omnipotent, to kind of think in a Winnicottian register about, needing to be able to believe that it is in charge of the world. When it's hungry, the breast appears, and this makes the breast good. When the breast doesn't appear, the breast is bad. This is the first split, right? Is what Klein would say, between the good breast and the bad breast. And it's toward the good breast and the bad breast that the infant begins to have fantasy, and where sort of internal states of unpleasure can get projected and attributed to the bad breast. And internal states of pleasure can be attributed to the good breast. And gradually over time, the infant begins to discover that actually the breast that's good and the breast that's bad are the same breast. And this could be a source of profound persecutory guilt because you've been chomping at that breast, and in fantasy you have been destroying and sort of carving out and devouring and filling up with shit that bad breast, but that's also the same breast that feeds you. So what the fuck are you supposed to do about this? And you could stay in a state of constant persecution and have the sort of the guilt that's associated with that, which is, I'm going to get locked up and destroyed. Or, and this is where the depressive position comes in, you could have the guilt that leads to some kind of repair, some capacity but that requires the capacity to integrate, which requires the capacity to bear the conflict between I hate and I love. And this is the sort of the neurotic's achievement insofar as the neurotic can be ambivalent. Whereas the person who's more on the borderline between neurotic and psychotic struggles with the ambivalence. And that could be because they sort of lack the psychic structure that's required to be able to hold what seem to be opposites. And, Klein, I think, would sort of situate that. And she says so somewhat effectively in a footnote. Let me find it here. The greater or lesser cohesiveness of the ego at the beginning of postnatal life should be considered in connection with the greater or lesser capacity of the ego to tolerate anxiety, which, as I have previously contended, is a constitutional factor. So it's a very complicating element. I mean, she's basically saying some babies are more constitutionally equipped to tolerate anxiety than other babies. And this sort of forms a lot of how we might think about who ends up struggling psychically with these kinds of intense anxieties.
That's really helpful and clarifying. And I think at the risk of saying something obvious, but I think I kind of want to do this just for people who have
none of this is obvious.
Okay. and I think it's worth saying that for people who are listening to this and are like, where did the breast come from? Right? Or being like, what's going on with all these breasts, right? And
just the one breast.
Just
really.
the one breast, right? Yeah. And or even just the idea of like there being a good breast and a bad breast. Like it's in other words, they're running up against the difficulties of how this is a vocabulary and a way of thinking, or almost like a state of parables and like a landscape that's very different from what we have previously been exploring, namely in the Freudian space, where like there's mom and there's dad and there's the kid's anxieties to dad. And then the kid grows up into a young man who has a neurosis. And then he goes to see Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund has a beard and he's like, oh, doctor, you remind me of my dad, right? In other words, Freud's dealing with people, generally speaking, and he actually says he can't deal with people who are not capable of thinking in terms of subject-object dualism and having relatively stable senses of self.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And developmentally then, that also, his developmental theory and his theory of where pathology comes from also only really starts with that achievement having been kind of reached.
Right.
And in other words, he begins with the Oedipal, with like there's this triangular relationship between the maternal function, if you want to use that language, the paternal function, and this like little kid. Whereas what Klein is doing is trying to explore the pre-Oedipal like developmental, but also like affective and constitutional states of the emergent child before it gets into a position where it can substitute people or relate one person to another person, or even like realize that mom is a human being who has two breasts attached, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that sounds bonkers or like really radical to think about, part of that is like the price of thinking. The price of entry for dealing with Klein. Like you got to get into the breasts and the shit and the excretion, etc. But it also is, we're thinking about how babies don't have language. They don't have subject-object dualism. They don't have object permanence, right? And if you pick up a baby and it's crying, that baby could be, it basically only has two settings, right? It's happy or it's crying. And if it's
settings.
Yes, right, it really does. And like you have to basically troubleshoot the baby to be like, is this baby crying because like, is the baby crying because one, it is hungry, i.e. its stomach is empty. Two, its diaper is full, it's excreted. Or is its stomach full of gas and does it need to be burped, right? The kid doesn't tell you. And also and this is, I think, the gambit that Klein asks us to make, but it's a very reasonable one, despite what it does to language. The kid doesn't know if its stomach is full or empty, right? It's in distress, right? It's this emergent state of what she'll trope as anxiety.
Well, this is where I wanted to just tag in for a minute here, Patrick, to paint with a broad brush for a moment. I think it's also, I think you're very right that you have to kind of like inhabit this Kleinian world to be able to get any traction into what we're talking about. But to riff on what you were talking about like the affective landscape of the baby, I think it's worth saying that, honestly, even to read Klein, you have to have a fairly high tolerance for distress. But the affective world of the very young infant that is being described here is just like of a different order. Like it's in a different universe than the way that Freud is thinking about it. And, I'm not sure that it's exactly right to draw from the language of philosophy to do so, but I almost think of it as something where like it's far more like the stakes of it, like the emotional stakes are far more existential, in the sense that like the things, the feelings with which this infant is being riven, are things like persecution, annihilation, profound threat. Right. I mean, it's not like Klein doesn't talk about, the feelings of like completion and wholeness that the good breast gives to the baby. But it is this landscape of paranoia, and of, annihilation is the right word. I'm plucking that directly out of the text.
Right. And in the face of those kinds of truly horrifying anxieties, what is one's recourse really except to be omnipotent and omniscient? I mean, how the hell else are you supposed to survive but to be all powerful and all knowing?
Right.
To be able to know what's happening. You're not going to be surprised, which is to say you're not going to be traumatized. There will be nothing out of order. Everything will be exactly as it must be. And this is the narcissistic situation. That's sort of one of the other, I guess I see as kind of one of the other terms to use somewhat interchangeably with schizoid. Not that they mean the same thing, but they kind of describe the same picture of what's going on, what's at stake here. And it's me being in charge of the world and in charge of my objects, because the alternative is, as you were just describing, a hellscape. Yes. An absolute hellscape.
Yeah. And so, Brian has has brought us into this essay, Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms from 1946, which is where the term projective identification first appears. And maybe this is a good moment, now that we have brought everyone into like Klein baby world with us, to think, in addition to thinking about splitting, which we've gotten to, and which is, the paper begins in a lot of ways with splitting, to think about in Klein these terms that I think are really going to be important for us to get into in their more than colloquial sense, which is to say projection, introjection, identification. Does that sound good to folks?
Yeah, and a through line here that we can just begin with is to really sit with those terms almost like in their etymological or like straightforward significance as like movements or dynamics in like this drama of the child trying to survive and understand where it is in the world and developing a better understanding of itself as some sort of object or a subject, right? And again, all the language is very hard there, but another way of saying this is, for Klein and contra Freud, from projection is like, you saw this aspect of me because of someone you saw, like, and there's all these, like, we're dealing with people here. Projection is happening on the level of like literally pushing outwards or absorbing in. And that's both like proto-conceptual, but also very embodied.
There's a nice line. I'm looking at Nancy McWilliams here again, who has a really good section on projection, introjection, and projective identification. And I'm reading this because I think it's clarifying, but also because it turns about the way that I had previously thought about these things. Like in my head, I think projection is like there's a thing that is in you that you externalize, like in the most basic sense. Like there's something is within, you put it without. There's two spaces. There's a directional relationship. And here's how McWilliams sums this up in one sentence. Projection is the process whereby what is inside is misunderstood as coming from outside, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about that. I don't know, because I don't know, for the two of you, do you have that sort of like visual image of like like I'm pointing at myself, it's like arrow outwards when you think of projection, like the thing that, you know what I mean?
I think so. I mean, well, and Freud thought of it as the sort of misuse of a normal mechanism, like the search for an external source for an unpleasurable experience. I mean, this all, kind of rooting it back in, the pleasure principle. And And, what is this source of unpleasure? It must be outside of me. And then sort of the misuse of that, meaning the overuse of that kind of otherwise normal mechanism that any of us would probably be in pursuit of. What's going on to me? I don't feel good. It must be that.
Exactly. It must be that. And McWilliams also has a parallel for introjection, calling it the process whereby what is outside is misunderstood as coming from inside. I think the thing that's like interesting to me, and maybe this is just my little like, fondness for like Lacan showing up, is like that I hear the misunderstanding as like misrecognition. Like is the sort of the error of perception.
I think, or another way of saying, I hear what you're saying, Abby, and I think part of it is like the logic of misunderstanding or of understanding or of recognizing or not recognizing all hinges upon the presupposition, at least in language, of a discriminating subject that can do these things.
Yeah.
And where there is like a legible distinction for us as observers between outside world and inner reality, right? And what we're actually talking about here, and again, I think it does crucially, as you've already indicated, Brian, a kind of double duty, both for trying to wrap our head around the chaotic interior life of the neonate, which has no sense of interiority. And it, maybe it's sucking on a breast sometime, or other times it's a bottle, or other times it's a thumb. And does it really know the difference? Who knows, right? And also like adults in extremis kind of breakdown states where the paranoid or sort of other types of decompensation can lead people to go kind of baby mode in certain ways, right? Is that the way in which, for Klein, as I take it, you get a integrated enough capacity to determine what is or isn't inside or outside is established through florid mechanisms of expulsion, putting out, taking in, claiming as you, disavowing as you, etc., that together build something that is more integrated and that they can then do things like recognize or understand or not. It's really hard to talk about.
It is. I know. I'm feeling so puzzled.
No, it's okay. We're taking people along with us.
Maybe a really straightforward example. So, like the root verb, right, with the we get with the JECT, right? In the Latin and Indo-European before that, it's like throwing or tossing. Like think about like something like ejection.
Yeah.
Right. You're in the F-35 as it's finally failing. You hit the eject button and then you fly out and you get decapitated by the cannon, because that's just how that works. Right. But it's like literally it's pushing out.
That's actually a pretty good Kleinian example.
Yeah, it's ejection, right? And note that prefix with the ject, sort of like the tossing, moving root verb there, is it emphasizes a movement out of. Right.
Quite a forceful one sometimes.
Projection.
Can I just say sometimes when I teach like first years Freud, and I play with this, we talk about it's usually like civilization is discontent. So we're like, how do you get to the superego? But so we think about like projection, but we think about like introjection. And I always use the example of projectile vomiting because it's like this really forceful thing that goes outward from inside the self to outward. Or to beyond the self.
So ejection is almost like it's drawing from, right? It's flight from.
Yeah.
Which can also be a kind of getting kicked out. Think about like, I don't know, like the baseball game where the umpire is like, you're ejected. You're out of here.
Right? They don't say you're ejected.
I know they don't say that.
They say you're out of here.
You're out of here. They toss a red card. No, it doesn't.
Do not. No.
But then projection, again, on this level, very simple stuff, right? It's something that is there's like a perspectival sort of shift here, like a directional shift. It emphasizes like a proposal is an offer that you're extending, or a proffer is something you're holding out. Here, it's a movement out that emphasizes a push dynamic from the source. And, in everyday language, people fighting. I don't know. Imagine if the umpire goes up to the pitcher and says, "You have to stop beating people with the ball," right? And the pitcher is like, "No, you're throwing the ball at people," right? Where they go, no, that's clearly not how that works. But that's like psychologically projected, right? This is a thing that I'm putting on you that actually I'm doing, right? Idiomatically. But
you're not allowed to use sports metaphors anymore. Play to your strengths, babe.
The other terms that we have here, just I'm going to gloss on this like level of just like etymology, very basically, right? Like there's this idea of like introjection, which just before we even talk about what it means for Klein, we just like, okay, it's introjection. So it's like a tossing into, or it's like it has some elements of like drawing from outside to within. And I think that's where those are the three like iterations of like eject, project, and introject, right? So and you could see them sort of as being both opposites, i.e. projection is me pushing outwards, whereas introjection is me like pulling inwards, and ejection is like me spitting out from. But what they all do is they kind of suggest movements across an incipient boundary.
Yeah.
So that's like our initial sort of gloss of, and then maybe we can walk through like how these terms work for Klein as she elaborates them as being more important than they are for Freud. And I feel like identification is, again, let's use this as like the most basic, right? Identification sort of etymologically involves the ascription of similitude between types or kinds, right? I see this as an instance of that. I identify with the umpire because, I don't know, I like their uniforms, right? Or I identify with the pitcher because I want to just throw things at people, right? In other words, that is already a process where, at least in everyday language, the terms that are being related are a little more stable and given, right? It's not what's being sort of taken for granted there, or at least kind of smuggled in, is this idea of some stability between I identify something in you. I understand that you are different from me, and I will be drawn to it. But it's not quite on the level, again, of like the baby stuff, where the baby is literally gnawing on you or shitting out words or otherwise like
taking in and I don't want to say putting out,
expelling, evacuating,
taking in and expelling. Yeah,
it's body horror. Like these, like body horror actually does some work here, right? This is like the grounding of initial embodiment through operations of literally like extruding or consuming or just ejecting violently. Whereas identification is about, it doesn't necessarily have the same, like the same stakes or the same, like I can identify with someone without eating them or feeling like they're going to destroy me.
But the Kleinian baby can't.
No,
and I think that's important, is that there is quite a lot of slippage here between the idea of introjecting to take the outside and bring it inward and identification, right? To take that self, or to take that external object into the self, in fact, for Klein, does constitute identification, and it also constitutes introjection.
So broadly speaking, then, the Kleinian neonate, right, or this infant, right, literally cannot speak, it's what infans means, is establishing itself or is trying to navigate the world as like a task of integration for which its initial tools are processes of projection, introjection, and ejection, etc. And that as it integrates, and then the work of identification here then becomes like a little more shaded, because the question is also, and this is, I think, the other axis to put on this, right, is that there is a type of like initial experiencing of attributes, namely like good, bad, right? Distressing is like this is bad, I want to eject it. Right? This is good, I want to
the
eject.
absolute states.
Yes.
I am either hungry or satiated. I am either distressed or I am not distressed. That there's very, very little kind of intermediate ground. And I think that's where, the introjection this is orality. This is where, Klein, following Abraham, who had been her analyst, and who was really bringing in these ideas around the sort of the oral sadism, cannibalistic impulse. I almost think of the sort of introjection as like an absorption into the organism,
Which it plays so nicely with the way that in this text, Klein says that she doesn't want to say that the infant is projecting on to the mother, but rather into, like projecting into.
Which sounds like an infant. Insofar as onto suggests a surface, which suggests separateness. Into is just sort of a transmission in.
Yeah.
Sort of between organisms that are not otherwise differentiated.
Right.
In the infant's mind.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Guys, I get to feeling a little nervous when we don't get into the primary text. So can we spend a little bit of time in this 1946 essay by Melanie Klein, Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, which is this place for the original appearance of the term projective identification, which is going to later take on some other meanings and is going to be, a vexed term that people will quarrel over and it will evolve. But can we look at maybe a passage or so? Does that sound good? Brian, you want to read for us?
Yeah. So she's talking about, one of the functions of the ego, of the developing ego, is to manage anxiety. And Klein thinks of anxieties as predominantly about annihilation and persecution. And so, and the footnote I read earlier about, the infant's capacity to manage those anxieties is often constitutional. You could think in terms of temperament, but also then this is where we think about what the environment provides and is able to provide based on, of course, the constituents of the environment, the maternal figure, the paternal figure, the other caregivers. Maybe we'll get into some later, the social kind of implications of how society is structured as in capable or not capable, willing or not willing to provide for, the organism, the infant, in the face of certain anxieties. And so she goes on then to develop more of the thoughts around what the infant does with its hate. And so I'll quote, "Together with these harmful excrements expelled in hatred, split off parts of the ego are also projected onto the mother, or, as I would rather call it, into the mother." And she has a footnote. "The description of such primitive processes suffers from a great handicap, for these fantasies arise at a time when the infant has not yet begun to think in words. In this context, for instance, I am using the expression to project into another person, because this seems to me the only way of conveying the unconscious process I am trying to describe." She goes on to say these excrements and bad parts of the self are meant not only to injure, but also to control and to take possession of the object. Insofar as the mother comes to contain the bad parts of the self, she is not felt to be a separate individual, but is felt to be the bad self. She goes on to say much of the hatred against parts of the self is now directed toward the mother. This leads to a particular form of identification, which establishes the prototype of an aggressive object relation. I suggest for these processes the term projective identification. When projection is mainly derived from the infant's impulse to harm or to control the mother, he feels her to be a persecutor. In psychotic disorders, this identification of an object with the hated parts of the self contributes to the intensity of the hatred directed against other people. As far as the ego is concerned, the excessive splitting off and expelling into the outer world of parts of itself considerably weakens it. For the aggressive component of feelings and of the personality is intimately bound up in the mind with power, potency, strength, knowledge, and many other desired qualities. I'll stop there and just kind of summarize what follows, which is that it's not just the bad parts of the self that can get expelled, it's also the good parts of the self. And so this is where, the hazards to the ego is another really critical idea that she's introducing. It's not just the sort of projecting out of bad parts of the self, but what goes with hatred and aggressivity is also ambition and capacity and the ability to think. And this is where post and neo-Kleinians really pick up Klein and make this work clinically. Is what happens is you forfeit your capacity to use your own mind. And that's one of the great sort of perils of this sort of projective phenomena.
So I'm just trying to think about this in terms of our like drama of this little infant, right? Where the infant is attempting to, even though agency is a fiction of language here, but the infant is on a track to understanding itself as a discrete thing that can navigate the world. It's also, though, for very basic biological reasons, at the mercy of its environment, of its caregivers, and has difficulty locating / tolerating bad feelings. So, I don't know, when the bottle runs dry, right? Or when the diaper is too full, it will, again, within this emergent sort of like topology or mapping of self relative to environment, it might be like, oh, the bottle is empty and that's bad, but I am the bottle, or like that badness is me, right? Or the horrible thing I'm feeling in my diaper right now as it gets wet and cold, that's also me and that's bad. But clearly it's not good to feel that you were bad. So some part conceptually of the child is going to be like, that's outside of me. The badness is out there. And so this is sort of an initial kind of necessary thing, because yes, of course, at some point we do want the child to know that the bottle is not part of its body and that, its full diaper is not it. But it's an initial sort of template for relating to the possibility of the self as containing badness. And this, if I take what she's saying here correctly, I think maybe you tell me, the task is this sort of fraught enterprise of trying to be like, okay, I am good. That means I have to push away the things that might strike me as bad, and they're not of me. And developmentally, that's necessary, but only sort of good insofar as it later leads to a more integrated vision of goodness and badness, and that maps onto better sense of the body, etc. But that also in adults, this kind of mimics what we see in people who are like, there is nothing that is bad in me, right? So does that sort of track? I'm trying to think of these two analogical modes at once.
It does. I mean, there's two things, at least two things. One is, for me, it feels, and I think this is, first of all, let's just stipulate, this is hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. Like, we all have very furrowed brows right now. For me, it's actually less the line where Klein introduces the term projective identification that's clarifying, so much as one of the earlier lines that Brian read, which is, insofar as the mother comes to contain the bad parts of the self, she is not felt to be a separate individual, but is felt to be the bad self. That, which I want to read alongside a line from just 2 pages prior in the same essay, that I think is helpful, because we're trying in some way to get, there's like the in and the out, but also like the in and the out doesn't necessarily exist yet because it's being navigated and negotiated and brought into being. But there's also always some sort of like isomorphism between the object and the ego at whatever stage, the ego is at, of being able to acknowledge or not acknowledge, or understand or not understand those are all too high level words for what I'm getting at, like the other as other. But Klein says, I believe that the ego is incapable of splitting the object. And this is what Brian was talking about before with like the good breast and the bad breast, which is actually the same breast. I believe that the ego is incapable of splitting the object, internal and external, without a corresponding splitting taking place within the ego. And that seems important to me because this is where Klein starts to like really break my brain in some sort of ways where like in a Freudian story, I feel like you kind of get the like, okay, eventually the baby understands that it's not contiguous with the mother, boundaries emerge. But here, like to split the other, right? To that like really like primordial early division of this thing, which is in fact, although not yet in fantasy, understood as both the good breast and the bad breast, but separately, like perceived as separately. That splitting is not just kind of turned outward. It's the splitting is more radical than that. And so like there's always this confusion between object and ego.
Well, right, because objects have been introjected.
Right, exactly.
Forming internal objects.
Right.
And then often it's the sort of the content of the internal object that's getting projected out onto the external object or into the external object.
Right.
And then that also can form a type of identification, like, oh, there I am. And then that can get re-introjected.
Yes.
And back and forth and back and forth. And so too with the projection of the internal object's contents out or into another, so too can be sacrificed or relinquished or lost parts of the ego, parts of the self, the capacity to think, the capacity to know, the capacity to see oneself as good.
Okay. That's really clarifying. So maybe,
yeah, that was beautiful.
That's, and perhaps I'll try and put this even in our cruder vocabulary earlier that I was floating earlier, where it's like, it seems to be the case that the infantile development as a process of moving from a state of unintegration to greater integration necessarily involves sort of like sorting mechanisms that mean that more integrated ego as it emerges is going to be cut off from some aspects of itself of necessity. And that on the one hand, I think that correlation between splitting of the objects and the splitting of the ego. And I guess we just say like objects here are not like physical, tangible objects. No. They're like archaic mental representations of experiences.
And usually they're people.
Yeah, but it's only the child's experience of the person. This is like asking, like, what's a sheet of paper with only one side, right? Well, no, you can't have a one-sided sheet of paper. What's a coin with only one side, right? But here you actually can, in this archaic landscape, you can have partial objects or like you got like
part objects. Yeah.
But also the objects themselves are always partial only in relation to one another, right? But the point that I'm trying to build to is this idea that splitting is necessary for developmental, like subsequent integration, because it like allows for an internal, like initial kinds of metacognition, I guess you could say, right? This is me, this is not me, right? This isn't her, this is not me, etc. But that there's always some possibility for a failure to integrate properly, or an integration that remains open-ended or that hasn't been completed. And that correlatively has some impact on the shape of the emergent ego. Does that seem to track? Okay. So yeah, we have that line from where like the projection of good feelings and good parts of the self into the mother is essential for the infant's ability to develop good object relations and to integrate his ego. However, if this projective process is carried out excessively, good parts of the personality are felt to be lost to the self, and the mother becomes the ego ideal, which results in weakening and impoverishing the ego.
And an overstrong dependence on external representatives of one's own good parts. You can see that in certain kinds of sort of more malignant, dependent kinds of character structure. I can't really exist without the other.
Mm-hmm.
All my goodness exists in the other.
Yeah, you almost get this sense of, and Klein writes about this when she's talking also about like the sort of like the fragmentation, like the sort of going to pieces of the self, is like of giving parts of yourself away, right? Like there's like a depletion, there's a diminishment of the self, which, you know, is also an inability to feel the self as some sort of integrated entity.
So she's like both describing, and I think this is very, very hard, because she's both giving us like that developmental account.
Yeah.
And also,
like everyone does this.
Yeah. And also we are necessarily also speaking in terms of like pathological, clinical sort of accounts. And even if we don't want to have like an essential distinction between the normal and the abnormal, at least functionally, we're talking about things that like adults or people with more established egos do, and how that resembles on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we're talking about things that happen developmentally. And I think is, again, maybe to ask for the listeners, but to not read this as like a predictive account where it's like, well, if you necessarily had this, if you had this schizoid disruption or this thing not integrate, you must necessarily become a schizophrenic or something later on. But rather I think it carries through like the dynamics or like the architectonics of this landscape, maybe in a way that is a little clarifying of what happens chez adults, even if it's not like a mechanistic account, right? And as she herself says on the next page, the processes of splitting off parts of the self and projecting them into objects are thus of vital importance for normal development as well as for abnormal object relations. As regards normal development, it may be said that the course of ego development and object relations depends on the degree to which an optimal balance between introjection and projection in the early stages of development can be achieved.
So I'm inclined to pivot to Bion, but I don't know.
Please,
I mean, we could just talk about this for fucking ever.
It's so hard. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it just feels so interminable trying to hang with Klein.
Yeah.
Where my mind goes thinking of Bion and what Bion does with projective identification, I guess, to me feels so clinically helpful.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Bion really comes to see what he would call realistic projective identification, as opposed to projective identification that's really more about the pleasure principle of just sort of discharge of unpleasure.
Yeah.
So he creates this idea of the container contained, and thinks that really, and gets us into more of like sort of projective identification as unconscious communication, but where Bion would say is also really the infant's sort of the growth of the capacity to think. And Bion situates, it's really elegant and also kind of wild, but he sees thoughts as preceding thinking.
Yeah.
And so, you know, thoughts is sort of comprised of this beta elements, sensory raw data that the infant has no capacity to do anything with. It's just felt. And so the infant projects its experience of these beta elements into the maternal container, who through reverie performs alpha function on these beta bits, transforms them into alpha elements that can then be taken back in, introjected or reintrojected, as it were, maybe introjected by the infant. And that in that sort of transaction, the infant now has the capacity to think. That it's thoughts that sort of push for the capacity to think, which requires the mind of another. So Bion said that the hardest thoughts require two minds to think them. It's so elegant. I mean, it's just so exquisite, really.
I mean, you're reminding me also of one of the first times that I encountered the idea of projective identification in a clinical text, which is in Bion's experiences in groups. Which I found to just be fascinating, because he seems to have this sort of non-pariah ability to take projective identification like both the fact of it and I guess you could say the contents of it just as data. And I think he makes it sound easier than I suspect it is, right? He has this kind of sense of like, once you get attuned to this, you should start to be able to know whether what you're feeling is what you're feeling or what is being transmitted. And that there is a way to know.
Yeah. And I think, for me, the kind of bridge between that, and I'm going to put it in sort of charmingly simplistic terms, is where there is projective phenomena, I hear a plea for help.
Yeah.
I need help with this thing in my mind that I lack the capacity to metabolize on my own.
Yeah.
So how that presents clinically, could look all kinds of different ways. And I think this is why there's often different sort of positions or reactions to projective phenomena based on how that gets conveyed.
Mm-hmm.
Often it's quite aggressive or violent, or it feels like this sort of intrusion, the ascribing of sadistic elements to me when I'm actually feeling quite benevolent, or, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, it's a plea for help. Help me think my thoughts because I can't do it on my own. And I think that's really what Bion brought in, that softens the Kleinian baby into someone that you might actually want to care for.
Yes, and it underscores the stakes because like the thoughts that the person can't think on their own may be like the most self-relevant, essential thoughts that they need to think, and which they have, to use this language of like the impoverishment of the ego, they may have sort of foreclosed or not had the opportunity to think, or they don't even have the capacity to it. I'm wondering, maybe just to tie in what you both are saying, right? And I love that we're turning to Bion here, actually. This is one of those moments where Bion's actually clarifying, where it's like, and I love this idea of the image of like the introjection thing with the mother-child dyad there, where it's like, it's like, I'm thinking about like animals that will like, or even adults that will chew a little bit of the food for the child, where it's like you're allowing more, you're helping metabolize. Like the child's developmental process of metabolizing is actually a multiple participant thing. But the through line that I think is helpful to preserve from Klein here is also this idea that the capacity to think, particularly the capacity to think in ways that aren't binary, or in ways that might force you to feel bad things, or think bad things about yourself, or think about the ways in which you could be bad, or in any event, that thinking in general oftentimes involves feeling bad, and oftentimes a capacity to sit with feeling bad. And if you're not just like your cognitive resources, but like your habits, and even like literally just like the amount of like ego that's available to you to do this work is hung up on dealing with these very basic questions, like how do I deal with this anxiety? How do I not fall apart, right? If you're still worried about that integration process, then like the threat of disintegration is much more urgent and real, and would make your tolerance for certain types of thinking much harder. And we could see how that might happen, to lead to real pathological phenomena, or at least to challenges in the therapeutic encounter.
Which is, I mean, from a Bionian perspective, that's the psychoanalytic task, is to build up the capacity to think one's thoughts. And thoughts mean feelings as well as cognition. It's not just cognition, of course. To expand one's own containing capacities so that the voltage of affect can go up, and without falling to pieces. That is the task, that is the clinical sort of project that we're embarking on. I mean, that's one take. It's not necessarily, coming to terms with one's instinctual impulses and then the conflicts that ensue, though that could be a part of it. That would be seen as almost secondary or tertiary to the primary task of developing the capacity to think one's own thoughts with the help of another.
There's that lovely line from Klein that I think speaks directly to this, like where she's describing analysis with patients who she describes as schizoid, and it's like interpretations which tend towards synthesizing the split in the ego, including the dispersal of emotions, make it possible for the anxiety gradually to be experienced as such, though for long stretches we might in fact be only able to bring the ideational contents of the anxiety together, but not the affect of anxiety.
Yeah. Yep. That's exactly right. I think it is from that Bion really grew his idea of the container contained, the affective piece.
Brian, I feel like we've been talking a lot about the patient, or, you know, in the Kleinian context, in the original text, we've been talking about the infant. We've been talking about let's say, like the projective identifier, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of this work, or at least a lot of the writing on projective identification, is by clinicians for clinicians. And, you know, I know that you're using this language, this Bionian language that I also find helpful, of the container and the contained. But do you think you can talk to us a little bit more from the, you know, the other side of the desk, or the other side of the couch is not really the right word here necessarily, about like what it's like to work in a clinical situation with projective identification? And maybe we can also get into why it is so associated with like more severely distressed patients.
So I'm thinking of, and I'm going to try to kind of composite patient in my mind to, you know, be thoughtful about that. But I'm thinking of, you know, there's sort of this, it's a kind of a multidimensional phenomena insofar as this thing that's happening seemingly defensively and that needs to get kind of worked out for the analytic dyad is also itself a developmental process of differentiating self from other, of also being able to go through kind of what Winnicott would consider, you know, like the sort of necessary omnipotence of being able to see one's impact on the world. That this also then can yield this more Bionian sense of container contained. And so I think that the term is complex because it can be used in so many different registers depending on what's going on with the patient. So I'm thinking of a patient who at one point described sniping at me. And so this gave way to us thinking of this kind of internal object called the sniper, which is a very dominant sort of internal object, really probably, I mean, it had a complete monopoly on his internal landscape. It was the only way of negotiating contact with others, was to sort of be on guard and ready to shoot. Any intrusion from an other is a traumatic surprise and warrants sort of a murderous response, even if preemptive. And so this would play out in session with me. But then oftentimes I would be the sniper. And even when I found myself using the most sort of warm, supportive tone, what the patient would hear was a complete attack. And sometimes this would get enacted. I mean, the treatment nearly blew up multiple times over and over again. You know, and gradually I came to see that I to use the words from this Matrani paper, I had to take the transference. And now I know I'm mixing up language with transference and projective identification, but sorry. And, you know, that to sort of really to read the script that was being assigned to me. I mean, I think this is where analytic work is quite a bit like method acting. You have to actually come to identify with this role that's being ascribed to you, even if it's so contrary to your own self-conception, because that's what the patient has to be able to do. They have to be able to externalize their own internal conflict and play it out. It's the only way to be able to work through it. I mean, if they could just think about it on their own, they wouldn't be in analytic care. In addition, it's presumably with the analysts that they can actually do this as opposed to their loved ones or their loved hated ones, who don't have the capacity or the will to help the person work through this. So I'm thinking then this patient over time, you know, and I'll add that as the the sort of experience of these attacking others brings with it the lack of the ability to defend oneself. And that's where we think of the projecting of the ego's capacities as well, or the splitting of the ego. So I'm thinking of a different patient who is sort of always on guard for attack and also feels totally lacking the resources required to survive, which would mean, the ability to think, the ability to pause before responding impulsively, the ability to use humor, the ability to apologize and then explain oneself in the service of repair. I mean, any of the things that accompany, being in relationship with others, colleagues, spouses, children. I mean, they all require ego function, to adapt to anxieties and to respond accordingly. And suddenly this person is just impoverished of the ability to do that, the ability to think, it's okay if I'm anxious and I say something foolish. I can go back and sort it out. Like, most of the time we have the ability to do that, depending on how we conduct ourselves in the world. So that's another example of something being projected and in that way forfeited from the mind of the patient. And now I'm thinking of a different patient who, over time has moved from really needing to act that out or enact the dynamics where I'm this bad person and they're the victim, to actually being able to say to me, I think that you might be feeling this way about me, but I don't actually know. Maybe I'm just projecting. The ability to actually not only just sort of know that, take responsibility for that. I mean, that to me is an example of the expansion of what can be contained, the ability to have the feeling of anxiety as opposed to immediately needing to evacuate it into action, to pause and notice it.
Yeah.
And not just the cognitive ability to do that, but actually the ability to even feel it in the first place, I think is another example where over the course of the analytic care, I have presumably been supplying by returning in words, rather than acting out. I think that you're extremely anxious about me right now. I think that you're afraid that such and such and such and such. I mean, that's the analytic work of returning something that has been put into my mind in a form that can actually be metabolized by the patient. And then gradually over time, and that's the Klein piece, Patrick, that you were reading, from just a cognitive understanding to an actual capacity to integrate at an affective level.
I was going to ask you, what does it feel like to be a container for projective identification?
I mean, it can feel very frustrating. It can compel me to sort of prematurely put things into words. It can compel me to want to intellectualize. It can compel me to want to dissociate and shut down, depending on sort of what's, I think, being projected. And this is the real hazard. Bion talks about how the maternal container that sort of refuses entry of the beta elements for any number of reasons, the mother's own traumatic history, current stressful situations, whatever it might be. If she's not able to do the alpha function on the beta elements, what gets returned to the child is a sort of an unworked on sort of reintrojection that leaves the child with, as Bion says, a state of nameless dread. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard. I mean, it's really difficult to be kind of constantly taking in something, depending on what might be going on in my own mind. Sometimes it can also be very arousing, I think. And this is an area that, Bion is not known for. Right? I think to a lot of critiques of Bion, Winnicott, and plenty of other object relations, that they sort of have been denuded of the erotic components of this. And so I think it's kind of interesting to try to bring that back in. Insofar as taking in something from the patient can be extremely arousing, depending on what it might be. Some kind of a developmental need. I think of my work with especially certain types of men who really desperately need to be able to go through a stage of phallic narcissism, to be looked at admiringly, like to see their big penis and to be so excited by it and proud for them. I mean, that's not something that I think we're inclined to want to do for boys and men. And so I think a lot of men come into my practice desperately needing to be able to have that experience, which I would consider a very erotic experience. And I think that's part of why it gets disavowed by parents when the child is going through it. And I wouldn't reserve that only for biological males. I think that plenty of other people really have the need to be seen with their magnificent phallic capacities and performance, and to be really excited by it.
I'm struck by how one of the temptations you describe is as like a flight from sitting with projective identification is the intellectualization or the delivering the premature interpretation. And it really makes me think about how this entire way of thinking, both conceptually and also clinically in terms of the subject populations, I think it, is kind of gold standard for, at least famously useful for, are people for whom the work of classical psychoanalysis as like a resolution of transference neurosis from a position of analytic neutrality, right? I.e., you're identifying back to the person the projections that they are putting on you, and where your countertransference experiences are essentially subjective data points about like characters that have already been in this story, or like attitudes of people that are already in this landscape that have been named, or themes that have come up. In other words, things that have been metabolized into language.
Right.
What's doing the pushing here or the pulling? Think about it either as like gravity or as like a lump in your stomach, or the thing that's not being metabolized is something unspoken in the subject of the person that you're interacting with, that they can't put into words for themselves. And if you give them words, that's not going to help them either. And in a way that's more kind of radically unhelpful than just a mistimed interpretation with a neurotic, because they have to feel something about themselves first.
You're describing the move in psychoanalysis, I think, from a more epistemological to a more ontological. I'm skeptical of pitting them as themselves a binary, because I think the best epistemological treatments are fundamentally ontological, and ontological treatments involve epistemological elements, insight building, insight-oriented treatments, coming to know something about oneself. And one of my favorite quotes, I say it constantly, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann purportedly said to Rollo May, one of the founders of existential psychotherapy, and she said, "Our patients need an experience, not an explanation."
That's good.
Yeah. And that's really what I think we're talking about, is the provision of an experiential transformation that is in self expanding the capacity to contain one's own thoughts about one's experience. And therefore, and this is the other important Bionian point, first you have to be able to think about your experience, and then you can learn from it. Because if you can't think about it, if you're sort of only capable of expelling the sensory experience for all of the reasons that we've been describing, the persecutory terror of encountering another and encountering the other in oneself, if you can't think about that, you can't learn from it. And that's one of the core Bionian ideas, is really to be able to learn from experience.
This is really clarifying vis-a-vis the themes of like grandiosity or sort of like manic personality types and symptoms, insofar as that it's like, paradoxically, the person who shows up and is like, no, I'm not going to, and who's just filling the room with themselves, right? For projective identification, but also through narration, etc. Even as they seem to be so agential and so larger than life, they're actually caught in that earlier sort of, to use our vocabulary that we were talking about earlier, like this kind of trap of like, I'm actually very passive in this, right? Or I'm actually, I seem to be the Lord of my own experience, but actually I'm letting experience that is inflicted on me predetermine everything I do.
Right.
And such that like they can't even, and they'll be like, it's all about me. Their inability to tolerate like the not me and me, or like they can't, something about that means that they're actually having less of a sense of me in general, right? The very assertiveness is dispositive of, go back to Klein, a core anxiety.
Right. And in that way, an impoverished ego. I mean, a very narrow, superficial, kind of two-dimensional ego.
Your ability to tolerate, I'll just speak for myself, my uncertainty and confusion here, yeah, has been transformational. Like, it's kind of amazing. Like, I envy your patience.
Oh wait, that was a nice. I couldn't tell if you were saying patience or his patience.
I think I was saying both.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about, and I'm going to keep chewing on it because maybe we'll come into this in the second episode. But I'm just thinking about how confused and anxious I was feeling earlier. And now I don't feel that at all. And it does feel like there's been some metabolic work going on with the three of us trying to hang with this really troubling concept,
Yeah.
Part of what I think what's so hard about this is that I think sitting with these uncertainties long enough activates a lot of anxieties we have about not just our own sense of agency, abstractly speaking, or even personally speaking, but just literally the ways in which like institutions and roles require us to be agential, to take responsibility for things, right? To supposedly state what we mean and ask for what we want and make interpretations or just interact with one another as though those interactions were transparent and accountability were clear. And this is really cutting against that.
Brian, this is my brain is on fire and in like both like a good and also slightly painful way. I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation and even more excited that we're going to have another one. So for those of you who want to hear more about projective identification, stay tuned because there will be another episode next weekend.
Yeah, we're going to put the term to good use.
Yeah.
Brian, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you and to learn from you.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely made possible and kept ad-free for everybody by the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to hear our follow-up episode, part 2, on projective identification, which will be available next week behind the paywall, and if you would like, in general, to get 2 additional episodes of Ordinary Unhappiness per month, including our journey through the standard edition, please come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Brian Ngo-Smith. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.